Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session, Decoding Dyslexia. And today we have Dr. Iris Berent with us. She is the Professor of Psychology at Northeastern University in Boston. And she has produced dozens of groundbreaking scientific publications. And she's got a very interesting topic to talk to us about today. And she'll be talking about her book as well. The slides will be available after the webinar, as will the recording. We will send you out a link with everything on it, so you'll have all of those. As the session goes on, if you'd like to ask any questions, please feel free to in the question box, and we'll answer as many questions as you have as we can in the time at the end. Also, we will continue the discussion, today's discussion, on our forum, which is forum.dyslexialondon.org. I'm going to put that in the chat box for everybody, and it will also be in the email that gets sent out to you in a couple of days with anything that we talk about today. So we'll have a summary on that email for you, so you don't need to remember everything. Okay, well, welcome to Iris, and thank you so much for joining us today. And I will be passing the baton across to you to talk about decoding dyslexia.
Perfect, thank you very much. Are we good as far as the video?
Yes, I will just make you host. Here we go. You are now host, Iris.
Let's see. So, oh, video is on. Hello. Thank you very much, Philippa. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to talk to the group, and I look forward to the discussion later and for your questions. So, in my talk today, what I'd like to do is address an interesting tension between two things. One is what science tells us about what dyslexia is. The second is what lay people think dyslexia is. So what we're going to do today is start from the point of view of science and tell us what dyslexia actually is from the scientific perspective. Then consider what lay people think it is, and you'll see that they have several basic misconceptions. So what we're going to ask then is, why are we so wrong in our understanding of dyslexia and why it matters? So starting first from the point of science, we need to ask first, what is dyslexia, right? There are several definitions of dyslexia that differ in all kinds of minor details, but I think there is a general convergence which I can illustrate with one definition. That is the definition of Dr. Sally Shaywitz at Yale. And in her view, developmental dyslexia is characterized by an unexpected difficulty in reading in children, unexpected difficulty in reading in children and adults who otherwise possess the intelligence, motivation, and schooling considered necessary for accurate reading to English. So the first thing that immediately jumps at you at this definition is that all we're getting here is really a symptom, difficulty in reading. We're given no definition of what the cause of the symptom is. And defining a condition in terms of symptoms is a problem because symptoms can arise from different origins, right? So if you have a headache, you might be having a cold, or God forbid, you might have a cancer, right? So defining symptoms by cause is problematic. It means that different individuals could have dyslexia for different reasons, and therefore the causes of dyslexia could vary across different individuals. That sets ourselves to problem, but this potential notwithstanding, it's nonetheless the case that when you look at the symptoms of dyslexia as seen in research, you actually see that there is a very consistent pattern of symptoms, a pattern of difficulties that you find across different individuals. One consistent problem, the area of difficulty that you find in dyslexia has to do with phonological decoding. Phonological decoding is the ability to link letters to their sounds. So if you see a novel word like blin, your only way to tell it apart is to engage in phonological decoding, to realize that B stands for B, L stands for L, put them all together, and then you get blin. And phonological decoding is a significant area of difficulty in dyslexia. So from this, you already begin to see that the problem here has to do with sound. And in fact, another area of difficulty has nothing to do with reading at all. It is phonemic awareness, which is merely your awareness that spoken words are comprised of sounds, that sleep, for instance, is made of four different sounds rather than one. And furthermore, your ability to manipulate those sounds. So if you take sleep and remove the first sound, you get leap. Phonemic awareness is an area of difficulty in dyslexia. Again, no reading is involved. It has to do with spoken language and awareness of spoken language, and yet it is an area of difficulty. In fact, the problems that relate to sound processing arise even when the task is very simple. So in one set of experiments in my lab, we asked individuals with dyslexia, adult college student, who are perfectly able and intelligent, to do a very simple task, namely, tell us whether a given sound is a speech sound or not a speech sound. So non-speech sounds like this. Speech sounds like this. Okay, so it's a super simple task. All you need to tell is speech or not, and yet individuals with dyslexia show reduced sensitivity in this task compared to skilled readers. So this is a problem that you find in adults. In fact, the roots of the problem are found already at 2-month-old infants. So in this study, researchers asked whether infants who are at risk for dyslexia show difficulties in processing speech sounds. The infants were considered at risk because dyslexia is a heritable condition. If you have dyslexia running in your family, then an infant who is born into this family is at risk of developing dyslexia. The question was, do infants who are 2 months old, way before they ever read, right? Do they already show some difficulty in processing speech? So to find out, these researchers simply played simple speech sound to these infants, like da or ga, and measured their speech, their brain response to the speech. And what they found is that the at-risk group responded to the sound ga, in this case, differently to the control participants. The problem here is not strictly auditory. It's not that you can't hear the sound, but rather it has to do with how the brain interprets these sounds. And in infants that are at risk for dyslexia, the interpretation of this speech sound is different. So summarizing all these areas of difficulty, already probably beginning to see a problem in a pattern here, and that is that the difficulties are all related to sound. They have to do with phonological decoding of printed words, with phonemic awareness, and with sound and speech perception. So you might wonder, right, what does sound processing have to do with reading, right? Reading has to do with printed words. Why is sound involved? And the answer is speech sounds matter in reading a great deal. In fact, it matters at 3 different levels: at the level of learning to read, at the level of the brain mechanisms that support reading, and also it matters with respect to what actually happens when skilled readers read. So to underscore this fact, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just explaining how speech sound matters in each of these areas. So the first area has to do when you just begin to learn how to read, before reading actually happens. And the big idea to notice there is that writing is really a code, right? The letter B is there as a code for speech, for the sound B. So to crack the code, to understand how reading works, you need to understand that a word like boy is actually made out of sound that includes the sound B. It's only if you recognize that the spoken words has B inside it that you begin to understand what the letter B is doing and what it's standing for. And this is such a fundamental and important recognition that is difficult for us to gain, because for us this is so obvious and automatic. So to try to make you kind of feel young again, I'm going to present you with a code that is in a writing system that you may not be familiar with. So here is a printed word in Hebrew. Many of you may not know Hebrew, may not know what it is, may not know even how many letters it has. So this is a whole code for you that is still unbroken. To break the code, it would be really helpful for you to know how it sounds. If I told you, oh, this is the word for call, it sounds like call, that's the word for voice. And if you further understood that the spoken word has a sound, has 3 sounds, then you might also understand that the printed word is comprised of 3 letters. If you know that the word, spoken word, begins with the sound ka, then you might also surmise that the first letter, that in Hebrew is actually on the right, is the letter for ka. And from this, you can further understand that if you have another word that has the same letter, it would sound like ka as well. So the key idea is that speech is your Rosetta Stone for writing and reading. What children need to understand is that spoken words have parts, that printed words have parts, and that these 2 parts correspond. And if you are not aware that spoken words have parts, if you have trouble with phonemic awareness, as we discussed before, then speech acquisition, the acquisition of reading is going to be difficult for you. So this is the first area in which speech matters. A second area has to do with the brain mechanisms that support reading. And the basic idea here is that reading and speech run partly on the same brain network. So if this is your brain and this is your speech network, to use a cartoon, then when you come to build your reading network, you're really using some of the same tracks. You're basically recycling your speech network for the purpose of reading. So it stands to reading that if the speech network itself is impaired, then when you come to build reading on top of it, then this is not going to run very well. And indeed, there is a very large research that shows that people with dyslexia, when you look at the brain, there are some structural and functional abnormality to the speech and language area in the brain. To use one example, this is a study by Paulus and colleagues that summarizes many other studies and shows what are the areas of difficulty in the brain of individuals with dyslexia. When you look at the suspects, they're all pretty much aligned along the speech and language pathways, including not only Broca's area in the left hemisphere, but also various areas along the temporal lobe, which are critical for speech processing. So the idea that language runs on speech actually also brings you to another insight that has to do with how skilled reading works. So if your goal in reading is basically to hop on the speech network in the brain, what you want to do is to convert the written code, which is not a natural code for language, into speech code, which is how human brains do language. So your goal for skilled reading is to convert letters, which are an unnatural code for language, into speech, which is the natural code for language. Then you're straight on the speech network in the brain. This means that as a skilled reader, what you're actually doing is engage in phonological decoding. And there is indeed a very large literature that shows that when skilled readers read, even when they read silently, what they're actually doing is engage in phonological decoding. It's totally automatic, it's totally unconscious, you're unaware of the fact that you're doing that, but you are doing it nonetheless. How do we know? Well, as cognitive scientists, what we do is devise all kinds of little tricks to try to catch you in action and to demonstrate that this is actually what you're doing. So to have a sense of that, let's kind of simulate one of those tasks. So tell me if the following words is a flower, okay? Yes, no, yes, 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 whoops, right? You are kind of tricked to say, yes, it is a flower, when in fact, this is not how you spell the flower rose, so the answer should have been no. So what this research has shown is that if the word sounds like the target, if it sounds like rose, then you're more likely to confuse it with actual target compared to another word that merely spells like rose, like R-O-K-E. The fact that sound matters above and beyond just spelling similarity means that people pay attention to sound when they read. The fact that they confuse the folds that are similar in sound more than folds that just are similar in spelling means that sound matters. It matters even though I didn't ask you to say aloud any of these words, and that in turn shows that when you read, as a skilled readers, you automatically decode the sounds. You pay attention to the sound, even though you're not aware of them. And therefore, if you have a problem in phonological decoding, which we know this is indeed the case for people with dyslexia, then it stands to reason that skilled reading is going to be difficult to develop. So yes, sound matters. And in doing so, this really kind of, I think, dispels an important and prevalent myth of skilled reading. So many people think of phonological decoding or phonics as the training wheels for reading. When you start learning how to read, you're using them, then you kind of grow out of phonological decoding and you don't do it anymore. Well, this is actually not true. In fact, to extend the metaphor, what phonological decoding is doing, these are the wheels on which reading runs. This is actually how you read. So sound decoding is not some training wheels. This is actually how reading works. And if this process doesn't operate properly, then reading skill is going to suffer. So to summarize, speech sounds matter in reading. It matters a lot at 3 different levels: in learning to read, in terms of the brain mechanisms, in terms of skilled reading itself. And this is the picture that reading science is telling us. So dyslexia primarily corresponds to problems in the perception of speech sounds and the decoding from print. It's not just in your head, it's a real problem that can be detected in the brain, and it's genetically based. It's also highly treatable by methods such as improving phonemic awareness, working on decoding, and doing so in the context of reading. So clearly, dyslexia is a problem that is somehow related to the processing of speech sound. That is what science tells us. Looking now at the picture that lay people have, it's a totally different picture. So to use one illustration, when you ask lay people, what is dyslexia? This is usually what they have in mind. It is some visual problem in letter reversal. And indeed, this is the picture that emerges. So there is a body of research where scientists went to lay people now and tried to figure out not what dyslexia is, but rather what lay people think it is. And the answer is invariably some problem with reading. So people say that dyslexia is a form of word blindness. It results from trouble in vision. A common sign of dyslexia is seeing letters backwards. And even some British student teachers said, not everybody, but some said that colored overlays and or tinted glasses were helpful to individuals with dyslexia. And this is not right. Now, to be careful here, remember that I said at the outset that dyslexia is a heterogeneous condition that can arise from different sources. It is the case that some individuals with dyslexia have difficulties with vision. So it is not entirely wrong that dyslexia cannot arise from visual difficulties, but this is not the typical condition. In fact, it's debated whether these difficulties, visual difficulties, are in fact the cause of the problem. But this is certainly not the majority of what you see. Likewise, letter reversal is not necessarily a symptom of dyslexia because it's actually quite common in all children when they learn how to read. So this is an example of a typically developing child who did not turn out to be, to suffer from dyslexia. But early on, when we learn to read, all children reverse letters, and later on they learn how to overcome this tendency. So seeing a child that reverses letter does not tell you that the child has dyslexia. And with respect to the color overlays, they don't help either. So don't just take my word for it. Here is a paper from a journal at the, I believe it's the Journal of Clinical and Experimental Optometry, right? And that's a paper for 200 from 2020 that summarizes a bunch of other papers that were published in the literature, not just one. And the conclusion that the authors provide here in the yellow part that you may not be able to read basically says that there is not yet a reliable evidence base on which to recommend colored overlays lenses for this alleviation of reading difficulties. So clearly what people have in mind is not correct. So, but there is a saving grace. Well, people are totally wrong about the causes of dyslexia. The one thing they're right about is that it is a biological condition. They do say correctly that people cannot help being dyslexic, it's in their genetic makeup. So we have these two beliefs, right? On the one hand, we have people correctly know that dyslexia is a visual problem. I'm sorry, people actually wrongly say that dyslexia is a visual problem, but then they correctly understand that dyslexia is a biological condition. Could these two beliefs be linked? Could it be the case that people believe that dyslexia arises from visual difficulties precisely because they believe that visual problems are more biological, whereas they believe that phonological decoding is not a biological capacity? To find out, in one study from a lab, we took lay people and invited them to play clinicians. So we're trying to figure out what lay people think dyslexia is. How likely, so we presented them with two individuals who suffer from reading difficulties and asked them how likely it is that they actually have dyslexia, how severe it is it a biological condition? And we presented them with two individuals. One, John, suffers from visual difficulties. For John, B is the same as P. He has these visual reversals. For Jack, the problem has to do with phonological decoding. So when you ask typical people, does K-A-T sound like an animal name? They tell you yes, but that's not the case for Jack. Jack would say that cat and bat sound equally like an animal name, and that's obviously a problem. So with this information in mind, here are these two cases. Tell us about what they think is the problem. Do they have dyslexia? How severe, and so forth. And here is what we got. When we ask people how likely it is that the individual has a disorder and ask them to respond on a 1 to 7 scale, what we found is that for the visual difficulties, people were more likely to consider them as suggesting a real disorder compared to phonological decoding. It's not a huge difference. It's a difference of 0.5 on a scale, but it's nonetheless highly reliable statistically, meaning that this difference really is consistent across individuals. It's not just 1 or 2 people who are saying that. Similarly, when we asked them how severe is the problem, people thought that the visual symptoms are more severe. With respect to the cause of the symptoms, people thought that are they biological or environmental? People correctly thought that dyslexia is more likely to arise from biological causes than environmental. But when considering the biological causes, people thought that visual symptoms are more likely to arise from biological causes compared to phonological decoding. With respect to prognosis, there were no difference between the two conditions. But when we asked them to tell us more specifically about the source of the condition, do they affect the brain? Do they run in the family? What happened if you clone the individual, which is really a way to ask, is it a genetic symptom? Then for all cases, people were more likely to choose the visual symptoms. So they thought that visual symptoms are more likely to affect the brain. to run in the family, and to transfer to upward. So to summarize, from the point of lay people's belief, they think that visual symptoms are more indicative of dyslexia and also more likely to be biological, to affect the brain, and to be hereditary. And that's, as we saw, is wrong. So then the question is, why people are wrong? What's the source of those misconceptions? And there are, of course, several possible answers to this question, not one. Perhaps people read about it somewhere in the media, perhaps they have relevant experience. Science actually might be partly responsible for this misconception as well, because early theories of reading did blame dyslexia on vision. And also, I noticed that some individuals with dyslexia do have visual difficulties, right? But I think it's interesting to consider the possibility that the misconceptions that we see here may not arise from external reasons, from what we hear about and from the media, but also internally, from how the mind actually works. So to explain what I mean by this concept, let's consider a concrete scenario, right? So let's consider the scenario of this mother who is sitting with her son, Johnny, and trying to figure out what's wrong with Johnny, why reading doesn't progress the way it should. What the mom is trying to do basically is to figure out how the mind works. And when we're asking, how is she doing that? As lay people will say, oh, she's just using common sense. But from the science perspective, common sense actually embodies a bunch of complex psychological principles. And like most of the good things in psychology, these are things that we are not aware of. These are principles that run totally under the hood, tacitly, but we can nonetheless demonstrate that those principles are important and they play a role. And here there are two principles that might be responsible for the misconceptions. And one principle has to do with how we think about bodies and minds. It's called dualism. A second principle has to do with how we think about inheritance and the essence of living things. It's called essentialism. So let's look at each of them in turn. People, even young children, thinks about bodies and minds in this state. We know that there is dualism in philosophy and religion, but dualism is also an intuitive principle that we apply instinctively when we think about other people. We think about bodies as made of matter. We think about mind as this ephemeral thing that is distinct from the body. And correspondingly, when we think about our psychological capacities, some capacities like vision are obviously linked to the body. We think that we see with our eyes. Actually, we see with our brain a lot of it, but from the lay people perspective, we can say, here is the organ that supports reading. Whereas for phonological decoding, we can't identify any organ that in the physical body that is doing that. So we're looking at that as this ephemeral thing. So you already see that vision is more readily identified with biology, with the body, compared to phonological decoding. And then it gets worse when we try to understand how these capacities arise. To do so, we call upon a second principle that is called essentialism that helps or guides how we reason about inheritance. So when young children try to understand why is that this child is like his father, the reasoning is there must be some piece of matter that the child has acquired from the father. They may not be able to tell you what this piece of matter is. They certainly may not know anything about genes, but the intuition is it has to do with matter. And here is where the problem lies, because if you think about inherited capacities as capacities that have to do with the body, and if you think about phonological decoding as this ephemeral thing that is right here in the mind, then phonological decoding cannot be an inherited biological condition, and therefore people assume that the real cause of dyslexia, if dyslexia in fact is inherited, must have to do with vision, not with phonological decoding, which of course is wrong. So what I'm really saying is that when this mom is thinking about what's wrong with Johnny, there are really these two principles that are running in her head, completely unconscious, but they're there nonetheless. And those principles are the ones that lead her to conclude that the problem is in vision. So to summarize what we have discussed here, we said that reading science tells us that dyslexia arises primarily with problems in processing sounds and their decoding from print. Lay people think otherwise. They look at dyslexia as visual difficulties. Why we get it wrong, that can be arising from several reasons, both external, say media and science, but also internal. Perhaps the errors that we see here arise from the very principles that make our mind tick. In other words, we are blind to who we are, and we are blind by design. Why does this matter? Well, it matters for dyslexia a great deal, right? We know that public misconceptions can exert a heavy toll because dyslexia, as we know, is a treatable condition, but to get treatment going, you need to identify who has dyslexia. And if you think that dyslexia is strictly a visual problem, and if teachers even think that, then that is going to delay or divert appropriate treatment from the children who need it. That may also, these misconceptions could well affect public officials. If you're a public official who make decisions about allocation of resources, and you think that what science tells you, that dyslexia is a phonological condition, is some talk about ephemeral things in the mind, then it stands to reason that you may not think that it's a serious condition that is worth the investment of public resources, and that's a problem. But going beyond dyslexia, if it's really true that the principles that make our mind tick really blind us to our own mind, then this may affect not only how we look at dyslexia, but many other capacities. So dyslexia may very well be here just the tip of the iceberg. And indeed, in this new book that has just appeared in Oxford, I'm showing how the very principles that make our mind tick actually make us blind to who we are. They make us blind to our true human nature. They implant in us all kinds of irrational beliefs. For example, these principles are responsible for our irrational love affair with neuroscience. Neuroscience is great, but people assign all kinds of irrational significance to neuroscience that it really cannot deliver. The reason for that has to do with how the mind works. The same principles are responsible for some of our beliefs about free will, about the afterlife, about why we stigmatize disorders, for example, why we stigmatize psychiatric disorders, and indeed they also affect why we fail to decode dyslexia. So my take-home message for you is that dyslexia is a real biological condition. It's not just in your head. Lay people have troubles understanding dyslexia, and it's not just because they're ignorant. It may very well be that these misconceptions arise from the principles that make our mind tick, and dyslexia is just inconsistent with these principles. By exposing these misconceptions, my hope is that we could improve public understanding of dyslexia, facilitate early diagnosis and treatment, and increase government funding for the treatment and research of dyslexia. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the group, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Iris. I appreciate that. And for your time today, we do have a few questions. Before we move on to the questions, I believe your book is available on Amazon, and yes, we do have links to it on the website, but I've just put a link in chat. Do remember that if you do buy Iris's book, please use smile.amazon.co.uk and choose us as a charity, as we get a small percentage of your sale without it costing you any more. Just to reiterate for those of you that joined us late to the webinar, that the slides and also the recording will be available on the same page that you signed up to, and we will be emailing you by Friday with everything, so you'll get a copy of those. We just have a few questions. We're also going to continue the discussion after this, not with Iris, but we can ask her questions afterwards if there's anything else that arises in our forum, which is forum.dyslexialondon.org. So I'm just going to move on to the questions now. Our first question is from Barbara, and she writes, in order to have a dyslexia assessment performed in the UK, the individual is required and advised to have vision tested by special optometrists. You are completely debunking the visual symptoms of dyslexia. How soon can we expect to see the science catch up with the assessment process?
Thank you, Barbara. Science has caught up. If you look at the literature, there are hundreds and hundreds of papers that show that people with dyslexia have phonological problems. This is not new from the point of view of science. Why? So I must say I'm not a specialist in assessment, so I can only give you my opinion as a scientist who does research on reading and also research on dyslexia, but I'm not a specialist on assessment. This being said, I would think that it makes sense that even if you correctly understand that the problem dyslexia is not in vision, you want to rule out visual problems, right? You want to rule out the possibility that a child who is sent to you with reading problems, that the problem is not simply that they need glasses for reading, right? So it makes sense to use visual tests just as a way of ruling out, just as when you go to the doctor and you suspect a disorder, first you rule out other conditions. I'm not familiar with the British system, but I think that could be one explanation of why vision is tested.
Great, thank you, Iris. Next question, and by all means, everyone, if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A as we're going along. Next question is, how many subjects participated in your study that has led to your conclusions? Did your study include both adults and children?
No, the study with adults had, I believe, 40 participants. The results actually we've replicated in many other studies, so I'm pretty confident that these misconceptions are reliable. The misconceptions that I cited, all these citations with citing what people say, have been documented in other studies as well. So I think that the notion that people believe, that lay people believe that the problem is visual is very well substantiated. I think that your question about children is very well placed. And yes, we do want to know what children think and what individuals with dyslexia think about this condition. So we are certainly hoping to extend this research and to figure out all these questions. This is a really excellent point that was raised.
On that as well, Iris, I was just wondering, with the group of people, participants in the study, is it from one particular country? Yes. Is there a certain amount of diversity there, or because I know that I'm moving a little bit into some of the other work we're doing, but diversity of thought is really big at the moment, and I know culture can also influence that.
So all these are important questions. It may very well be so the results that I report here, we're obtained from individuals who are English speakers, who are mostly sampled from the US. Whether other countries and other cultures will show the same symptoms is an excellent question. We do not have the answer to that yet. The reasons, if we are right on the theory of why the misconceptions arise, then those roots of the misconception, dualism and essentialism, the one I mentioned, have been documented in other cultures. These are not by any means a Western phenomenon. So there is the potential, if these principles are really the cause of the problem, there is the potential for these misconceptions to be quite general. Whether in fact they are, we don't know yet. So actually the results that I've reported to you are right off the press, right? We are in the beginning of this research project, and I hope to be able to answer those questions soon.
Great, thank you so much. We have a few more questions. Someone has asked, how are you hoping to influence government and legislators with your studies?
It is going to take time and work. I think the first step in fighting misconceptions is knowledge and wisdom, right? So by shedding light on the fact that these misconceptions exist, if you can demonstrate to people that here is what many people think, then this is a first step for a public official to maybe identify themselves in this thing and to say, oh my God, I actually am, that's what I think, it's wrong. And in so doing, hope to combat the disease. So I think, combat the problem. So I think, and in fact, by sharing, one way to combat the problem is to share this information and the results of the research with interested parties like this group, so that you are aware that these misconceptions exist, and therefore you can use it to argue and to promote the actual better and correct understanding of science.
Great. Actually, Barbara's also mentioned that our health minister in the UK is actually dyslexic.
Oh,
so,
wonderful.
Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah. So that's, yeah, this is great, because this, yeah, that's a great starting point. Yeah. Unfortunately, in the US, we can't say any good things about our government at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll probably stay off politics today. So the next question is around, you say that overlays don't help, but what about font and font size, background colors, etc., that are often suggested as being more dyslexia friendly for reading? Now, I think this is an interesting point, because even myself, there's a bit of resistance, because I myself am dyslexic, and absolutely using a green overlay definitely helps me to see the letters more clearly. Now, it could well be that is to do with something else rather than dyslexia. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I want to be careful about suggesting therapies and interventions, because this is not my area of expertise. I'm reporting here research that is out there, and this is what is suggested by this research. I think that there is also a difference between making a distinction between our visual problems cause, which apparently that's not the cause in most individuals, maybe in some, but not in most. And the second is, what can you do to help a person combat a problem? Even if a child doesn't suffer from a visual problem, some children might, but most apparently do not. Even if for those children who do not suffer from this problem, from my perspective, and here I'm talking completely naive because this is not my expertise, I can totally see how calling attention to letters, whether it's by font size or by color, anything that can help you pay attention to the printed word might help. So that the fact that you can use these aids to help may still be correct, even if the underlying problem is in decoding. So I can see a situation in which using special font can help direct a child's attention to the word, and in so doing, help work on the real problem, which is phonological decoding. So I think that these ideas are really in synergy rather than competition. I can see how a problem that, even if the problem itself is phonological, it might be possible to help mitigate against the problem using visual aids. Do they help? Well, at least the overlays, according to this report, says that they don't. But I think that really I don't want to give any pronouncement about any treatment and certainly not for any individual based on this, based on my individual expertise.
Yeah, no, I understand, and everyone's very different. And so it's almost like kind of taking a paracetamol when you've got a headache, but the headache is really part of a much bigger problem that you have. Yeah, no, I understand that. That's great. Thank you very much. I think we just have one more question. If anyone has any last questions, do let us know, because we're on our last question now. I'm not sure this is something you're going to be able to answer, but I'll ask you anyway in case you have any insight on it. And if not, I can look further afield for this person. But Fee says, is there any evidence to support attention deficit as a symptom of dyslexia?
Well, attention deficit disorders and ADHD and dyslexia are highly comorbid, meaning that these two conditions tend to co-occur together. So it is, in fact, common to find individuals with dyslexia who also suffer from attention difficulties. The problems, the two conditions are distinct. So ADHD and dyslexia are not the same symptoms, but it so happens that they tend to co-occur together, and therefore it's common to indeed find them in the same individual.
Okay, great. But it wouldn't be classed as a symptom of dyslexia. They co-occur together rather than being a symptom.
Exactly. The thinking about them as that these are two different conditions, which just happen to co-occur together. So I don't know, maybe think about it as diabetes and hypertension. These are two different disorders that might co-occur together.
Yeah, absolutely. No, well, that was absolutely, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Iris. Thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about today or mention to anyone? We have your book link, and we will be sending everyone out the link to the slides and the book and also the audio on Friday, so in a couple of days' time. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say before we wrap up today.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the group. It was wonderful. Oh, and hello to Argentina. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to the group, and just encouragement from across the pond to keep up the good work with affected individuals and children, and to help the fight to alleviate dyslexia. I'm honored and happy to being able to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Iris. We appreciate your time today and look forward to hearing about your research in the future.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.